Picture this. An Allied aircraft spots a German U-boat cutting through the grey surface of the North Atlantic. The pilot dives, the crew braces, the depth charges drop. 1, 2, 3, perfectly placed, right on top of the submarine. And then nothing. The U-boat slips beneath the surface. Survivors. Again. The aircraft banks away into the clouds, the crew hollow with frustration, knowing that somewhere beneath that dark water, a crew of German submariners is laughing. This was not a one-time failure. This was happening every single day, on every patrol, across the entire Atlantic. By 1941, Allied aircraft had carried out hundreds of attacks on surfaced U-boats and achieved a kill rate that made commanders grind their teeth in disbelief. 1%. For every 100 attacks, 99 U-boats survived. Something was catastrophically wrong. And no one, not one senior officer, not one experienced pilot could figure out what. To understand why that single percentage was so devastating, you have to understand what was riding on it. By 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic was the war within the war, and Britain was losing. Admiral Karl Dönitz had perfected his Wolfpack tactics, coordinating groups of U-boats to overwhelm convoy escorts and tear apart merchant shipping lanes. In 1940 alone, German submarines sank over 4 million tons of Allied shipping. In the first 6 months of 1941, that figure climbed higher still. The lifeline that kept Britain fed, armed and fighting, the endless procession of cargo ships crossing from North America, was being severed, convoy by convoy. Prime Minister Winston Churchill later admitted that of all the things that frightened him during the war, the U-boat peril was the only thing that truly kept him awake at night. And it wasn't for lack of trying. RAF Coastal Command had been tasked with hunting submarines from the air, an extraordinarily difficult assignment given the technology of the time. Aircraft gave the Allies an enormous theoretical advantage. A submarine on the surface was fast, but an aircraft was faster. A U-boat commander who spotted a plane approaching had perhaps 90 seconds before the aircraft was overhead. The correct response was to dive, immediately, and without hesitation. If the submarine could get below the surface in time, the attacking aircraft would have to drop its depth charges blind, guessing where the vessel had gone. The pilot would set the charges, they'd splash into the sea, sink to the preset depth, and detonate. Problem was, by the time any of that happened, the U-boat was already somewhere else entirely. Every time the depth charges went off at 100 feet below the surface, the submarine had already turned, already moved laterally, already placed itself well outside the lethal radius of the explosions. Dönitz wasn't wrong when he boasted with pointed arrogance that the U-boat has no more to fear from aircraft than a mole from a crow. On the surface, he was right. Those charges were detonating deep in empty water. The Atlantic was swallowing them whole. What made it worse was that nobody at the operational level seemed to recognize the precise nature of the failure. Pilots blamed bad luck. Commanders blamed inadequate explosive yields. Some argued for more aircraft, others for different weapons entirely. The systemic, mathematical reason for the failure, hiding in plain sight in the attack reports stacking up on desks from Iceland to Gibraltar, went completely unexamined. Until one man started reading. Patrick Blackett was not a military man. He was a physicist, one of the finest of his generation, a Cambridge professor who had worked under Ernest Rutherford in the Cavendish Laboratory and would eventually win the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1948. When the war began, Blackett was drawn into the scientific war effort, initially helping develop radar and anti-aircraft fire control. But it was when he was brought in to lead the newly formed Operational Research Section, or ORS, attached to RAF Coastal Command in 1941, that he found the problem that would define his wartime contribution. The concept of operational research, the idea of applying rigorous scientific analysis to military operations rather than just to weapons design, was radical in 1941. Commanders were accustomed to soldiers, sailors, and airmen making decisions based on training, instinct, and experience. The idea that a professor with a slide rule might see something that a decorated wing commander had missed was, to put it gently, not universally welcomed. Blackett's team, which included E.J. Williams, 2 scientists who would later receive Nobel Prizes, and a collection of physicists, astronomers, and mathematicians, was assembled from across British academic life. They were, by military standards, an eccentric group. The RAF called them, not entirely fondly, Blackett's Circus. What made Blackett different was not genius in isolation. It was his insistence that the data already existed. Every attack, every patrol, every mission was generating written reports. Those reports contained times, positions, depths, outcomes. Nobody had treated that information as a data set. Nobody had asked, what do all these attacks have in common? What are the ones that failed telling us? Blackett sat his team down and told them to find out. And what they found should have been obvious. But in the fog of war, with command structures focused on the next convoy and the next patrol, the obvious had gone unseen for 2 full years. The pattern emerged quickly once the data was properly examined. When the ORS team mapped out the attack reports and began correlating times, positions, and outcomes, a number came back immediately. And it was damning. In approximately 40% of all aircraft attacks on U-boats, the submarine had either still been visible at the surface at the moment of the attack, or had submerged less than 15 seconds before the depth charges dropped. 40%. In nearly half of all their attacks, Allied aircraft were dropping charges on submarines that were essentially still on the surface, or only a few feet below it. And yet they were setting those charges to detonate at 100 feet, in some cases 150 feet. Think about what that means. The aircraft was in exactly the right place. The crew had done everything right. The U-boat was right there. And then the depth charges sank past it, 20 feet, 40 feet, 60 feet, 100 feet down, and detonated in the darkness below a hull that was still practically scraping the surface. The lethal radius of a standard 250-pound depth charge was 15 to 20 feet. A charge detonating 80 feet below a U-boat that was barely submerged was doing nothing at all. Nothing except announcing to the crew below that they had, once again, gotten away. The standard fusing depth had been set at 100 feet based on a seemingly logical calculation. The average time between a U-boat sighting and the moment of aircraft attack was about 50 seconds. A diving submarine descends at roughly 2 feet per second. 50 seconds, 2 feet per second. 100 feet. The mathematics were sound. The assumption behind them was not. It assumed that the U-boat would always dive the moment it spotted the aircraft, that it would always have time to spot the aircraft. But radar was changing the game. Aircraft equipped with early radar sets were finding U-boats in low visibility, in rain, at night, at angles that gave the submarine no warning at all. In those cases, in 40% of all attacks, the charge depth was not a calculated military decision. It was a fatal, self-defeating mistake. And here is where the story takes the turn that the senior officers who heard it found almost insulting in its simplicity. The fix was not a new weapon, not a new aircraft, not a new tactical doctrine that would require months of retraining. The fix was a number. Change the fuse setting from 100 feet to 25 feet. Blackett and his team presented the finding with all the statistical rigor of a peer-reviewed scientific paper. They showed the attack data. They showed the geometry. They showed why the current settings were failing, and they showed, precisely, quantitatively, what would happen if the fuse depth were changed. The projected improvement was not marginal. The mathematics said that a 25-foot fuse setting would transform the kill rate on surfaced or near-surfaced U-boats from negligible to genuinely lethal. The logic was undeniable. If the submarine was still at or near the surface when the aircraft attacked, a charge set to detonate at 25 feet would go off right alongside it, within lethal range, with full devastating effect. The reaction from parts of the air staff was, to put it diplomatically, skeptical. Some officers questioned whether charges detonating that shallow would even work properly. There were concerns about blast effect on the attacking aircraft itself. A charge going off just 25 feet below the surface would send a column of water and shockwave upward with considerably more violence than one detonating 100 feet down. Some called it reckless. A few used stronger language than that. The pilots would essentially be flying through the aftermath of their own weapons. 25 feet was almost no depth at all, barely the height of a two-story building beneath the waterline. It felt, to men trained in the cautious logic of naval warfare, almost suicidal. What Blackett's team did next was characteristic of the operational research approach. They didn't argue with intuition. They argued with numbers. They went back through every available attack record and built a statistical model so thorough, so methodically constructed, that the counter-arguments melted away one by one. They demonstrated that the aircraft blast risk at 25 feet was manageable if the pilot maintained the correct release altitude and airspeed. They demonstrated that the charges would function correctly at that depth. And they demonstrated, with a clarity that brooked no further debate, that the current approach was not failing by a little. It was failing catastrophically, and had been failing for 2 years. Gradually, through what the historical record describes as a long evidentiary process, Blackett and the ORS persuaded the air staff to change the fuse settings. Not immediately, not all at once, the military rarely moves that fast, but progressively, squadron by squadron, the depth charge fuses were recalibrated. 25 feet. The results began coming in almost immediately. The kill rate on attacks where the U-boat was still visible or had dived within 30 seconds, the 40% of attacks that had previously been almost entirely wasted, began to climb. Crews who had flown patrol after patrol and watched their charges explode uselessly in deep water started returning to base with confirmed kills. The same aircraft, the same pilots, the same basic weapon. One different number on a fuse dial. The statistics that emerged from subsequent operational analysis were stark. Before the change, attacks on surfaced U-boats, and those who had dived moments before an attack, resulted in a kill rate of around 1% and a damage rate of about 14%. After the adjustment to 25-foot settings, confirmed kills rose to around 7%, a sevenfold increase, with damage rates also climbing. For submarines caught partially submerged in the act of diving, the numbers rose further still, 11% sunk, 15% damaged. As Blackett himself observed afterward, and this is one of the most understated assessments of any wartime innovation, there can be few cases where such a great operational gain had been obtained by such a small and simple change of tactics. But the numbers on paper only tell part of the story. Behind every percentage point was a patrol over the freezing grey Atlantic, a crew of Coastal Command airmen in a Liberator or Sunderland or Catalina, holding their nerves together through 8, 10, 12 hours of flying. And now, when the radar set pinged and the pilot pushed the nose down and the U-boat filled the windscreen, the charges they dropped were doing what they were supposed to do. The water went white, the hull buckled, the submarine did not resurface. The effect rippled outward through the wolf packs. Donitz's U-boat commanders, who had grown accustomed to treating Allied aircraft as a manageable nuisance, dive, wait them out, surface again, began losing boats to aircraft attacks that, by the old arithmetic, should have been survivable. The certainty that underpinned their tactics began to erode. If the aircraft over the Bay of Biscay were suddenly killing submarines that had been submerged for less than 30 seconds, then the calculation of when to dive, how fast to dive, whether to fight on the surface or run, became dramatically more dangerous. The 25-foot fuse setting didn't just kill more submarines. It changed the psychological calculus of survival for every U-boat crew that crossed the Atlantic. The impact of the depth charge fuse adjustment was inseparable from a broader transformation happening in Coastal Command throughout 1942 and 1943. The ORS team was simultaneously pushing improvements to aircraft camouflage. White undersurfaces that made patrol planes harder to spot from below, allowing them to close to within 20% closer before detection. They were refining attack patterns, improving the Torpex-filled depth charge design for greater explosive yield, and integrating the ASV Mark III centimetric radar with the Lee light for night operations. Each of these changes multiplied the effect of the others, but the fuse depth change was, in the dry language of the historians who studied it, the single most dramatic improvement in kill rate achieved by any single tactical modification. By 1944, the lethality rate per attack on a visible U-boat had climbed from roughly 2 or 3% at the start of the war to approximately 40%. In the final months of the conflict, it reached 60% on surfaced submarines. Of the 1,150 U-boats commissioned by the German Navy, 289, about 25% of the entire fleet, were sunk by aircraft. Air power accounted for approximately 36% of all German submarine losses. And at the mathematical heart of that transformation, in the foundation beneath every radar sweep and every Lee light patrol and every Torpex explosion, was the quiet insistence of a physicist with a statistics report, arguing that the number on the dial was wrong. Patrick Blackett went on to the Admiralty after Coastal Command, continuing his operational research work across the naval war. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1948 for his pre-war work on cosmic rays and particle physics, work he had effectively set aside to spend the war studying attack reports and fuse tables. E.J. Williams and the other ORS scientists returned to their respective fields. The operational research section itself became the template for what modern militaries call operations analysis, the institutionalized application of scientific method to military decision-making. The field that Blackett's circus pioneered in the desperate Atlantic patrols of 1941 is still practiced in every major military organization in the world today. There is a particular kind of courage that history tends to overlook. It is not the courage of the man who charges a machine gun position, though God knows that deserves its place in the record. It is the courage of the man who sits in a room full of senior officers who have spent their careers doing something one way and says, "The data shows you are wrong." The courage of Patrick Blackett and his team was not physical. It was intellectual, and it was relentless. They were not wrong. The fuse depth was wrong, and changing it saved ships, saved convoys, saved the lives of merchant sailors drowning in the North Atlantic, and brought the war in the Atlantic one critical, quantifiable step closer to its end. A number on a dial, 25 feet. That was all it took. And the men who had scoffed at the suicidal shallowness of the idea watched, in the months that followed, as the kill counts climbed. If you want more stories about the quiet wars inside the war, the scientists, the mathematicians, the code breakers, the analysts who changed the shape of the conflict from behind desks and inside laboratories, subscribe and hit the bell. There are more stories like this one than history has told. We're going to tell them.